Hey everybody. So I wanted to do a little bit in this particular video to talk about the quiz that we had on Friday, and also to just kind of do a bit of kind of bringing things together and helping to set the stage for today's content from our discussion that was due last night. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the quiz. And for the most part, I thought like the quiz went pretty well. I actually did apply a slight curve because I felt that students had difficulty with the very last question about ranking. Actually, when you're making the quiz and you're doing the videos, you don't get to see how it's presented to students, and I thought there was something a little odd about the way that there are sort of, I mean, at least like when I was trying to view the question, there were actually numbers in the question itself, which I thought could potentially be difficult when you're trying to order things in your head. And I also realized after looking at the statistics on it that I do think there was something kind of confusing about the very last question, in the sense that if you're thinking about like, okay, well, like which ethical theory is using more principles, it's difficult to figure out how to parse the level of analysis and figure out like sort of what counts as a principle. So what I ended up doing was actually, we had actually like a really nice, pretty statistics on it on the quiz, but I just went ahead and bumped everything up a little bit because I was like, yeah, we should just throw out that question. But I wanted to talk about the question actually, and that's kind of one of the things that I think is really helpful about having these quizzes, is that then I can give them and go, oh, well, seems like we need to talk more about this. So it seems like there are these confusions about like, well, how do you how could you parse, or like how do you decide like what happens at the level of a principle? I think in some sense this is just like a really kind of tangential question where if you're really familiar with the area, like me, it seems kind of like, oh yes, well, this is a principle. And if you're not, it's kind of confusing. And frankly, I don't think it really matters for the level of our class. What I do think matters for the level of our class is thinking about more or less complex kinds of reasoning, or like, like where are you kind of like bringing things in? And like how do you think about the kinds of tools that you have when you're engaging with these really difficult questions where you have tough trade-offs? And so that's kind of why I wanted to do the sort of like morality play quiz, right? Because I think it really highlights the sense in which like there are these really complex tools that you might think are important, and some people disagree about whether they are important or not. For me, when I'm thinking about how complex, or how, how many different kinds of principles an ethical theory is using, I tend to think that consequentialism is the simplest. It involves the least number of principles. Because all you're really doing is saying, all right, what are the best consequences here? And I think that there's something also really important about the fact that when you're thinking about best consequences, most consequentialists just think about like, yeah, I mean, are people happy at the end? Did they like it? So it's a pretty naive account where it's just like, all right, make as many people happy as you possibly can in everything that you do. So in that sense, there's really only one thing that you're trying to do. And it's true, cost-benefit analysis is a tricky process. But if you're thinking about like what it is that you're aiming at, you're really only trying to do one thing, and it's difficult at that level for anything to kind of conflict, right? Like one of the critiques of consequentialism is that like, yeah, you can kind of just throw people under the bus and say like, yeah, I know you hated that, but like, guess what? We just used you to make all these other people happy. Right? And there's a sense in which consequentialism thinks that sometimes that's appropriate. So it's a really simple theory where what you're really just trying to do is, in some sense, it's just like one thing, right? You're trying to make as many people better off or happier as possible. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have something like virtue ethics, where, you know, there's a lot of like one of the things that what we have to do when you're thinking about a given situation is ask yourself a series of like, does this require bravery? Does this require honesty? But one of the things that's interesting there is that bravery and honesty can actually, like, or like maybe it requires kindness. Like maybe kindness is a virtue, right? You could imagine that there are a lot of different kinds of things that might be valuable that like could even come into conflict, and you don't even really know what maybe like in some circumstances you might be brave to do this one thing, but like bravery, you know, like it seems like there's a lot of like wiggle room here where figuring out what the virtues require is going to be really complex. And that's a lot of principles, right? Because like it's like, well, if you're asking yourself what is required by the situation and the virtues, you're going to have to go through and think about all the different virtues. And that's going to get really messy and difficult, and people are going to disagree. So that's a really complicated theory, and there are a lot of different principles that might come into play. So that's probably going to be like that's for me like that number 3, right? That's a really complex way of thinking about things. And I think in the middle is something like deontology, actually, where it's a little more complex than just thinking, well, you know, we're trying to make as many people happy as possible. You know, like Kant has 2 principles that he's trying to apply. But, you know, and it's going to involve a little bit more than that and a little bit more wiggle room, but it's not quite as contextual as virtue ethics. But what I ended up doing was just kind of bumping everybody up and in essence just sort of like throwing out that last question. Although I'm really glad that I asked it, because it was really interesting to see what people were saying about how they would rank the different principles. And that, I think, is actually a really valuable exercise that, in some senses, as I was thinking about it, I was like, you know, a lot of the things that students are saying about this are really good. And I think, you know, I don't want to mark this question off. So what I ended up doing was just kind of basically throwing it out and bumping everyone up. That actually leads me to another point about the quiz, which is that if you're taking the quiz and you have, like, you're unsure about a question, there is a way for you to enter text about it, and it's really helpful for me to, if you go in and enter your sort of thinking about it. There were lots of instances in this last quiz where students had done so, and I actually went ahead and just gave them a point, even though, like, sort of with automation, it seemed like it was off. So please do take the opportunity to sort of enter in text to sort of explain your thinking with different questions if you're unsure about an answer. You don't have to do that, but I do think that it's very helpful, and I don't mind if you do it all. So it'll automatically grade it as it is, but it'll flag it for me that there was something that you added, and I can go back and read it and be like, oh yeah, this is what they were thinking, and you know, like it just seems like it gives me more feedback into how you're thinking about it, and I really appreciate that insight. The other question that we had, we actually, the statistics on this question were very strong, but I did want to address that because we had a question about number 5 regarding like different kinds of consequentialist thinking and virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is a little bit more of a hybrid in the sense that you're not thinking about actions per se, but rather the qualities of the individuals who are performing actions and how you sort of, you know, like how, like what's the brave thing to do in this case, or what's the honest thing? And then people who are brave or honest are people who like you know, I mean, it's like, well, for the most part, they're brave and honest, right? Like they act in these ways. But in some sense, we can sort of think about what those virtues mean by the sort of really reasonable people like having to make decisions over the long run. So there's a really big difference between virtue ethics and other kinds of things in that, like, for in some sense, we're focusing more on people's characters and what they typically do as opposed to like individual actions. But as you're thinking about what the virtues are and sort of like how you would describe them or what you would say it would mean to be brave, there's going to be an element of like consequentialist thinking, right? Like if it turns out that insofar as like we think something is brave, but if everybody is brave, things go really, really badly, it's probably not a virtue. right? Like this is probably not what we want to be happening. So it's true that when you're thinking about the level of like individual choices that people might make, sometimes a virtuous person will make choices that, all things considered, more people would be upset by than would be made happy. And so it's not really consequentialist, and it's not always the case that consequentialist thinking can track what's happening in virtue ethics. But it's also true that when you're trying to figure out what the virtues are, there's going to be a sense that like, well, yeah, but like if everybody screws up, you know, or but I mean like if bravery just makes everything go to hell, it's not a virtue, right? So there is a sense that there's going to be some kind of consequentialist thinking that is involved in the process of like figuring out and ascribing the boundaries to different kinds of virtues. And this is, I think, a really important thing, because the process of thinking about our ethical toolbox and how things go is really, really messy. The other thing that I wanted to talk about here is that I kind of wanted to kind of do a little bit of a recap of the discussion that happened last night and yesterday as well. I thought it was really fascinating, and I think I just kind of wanted to do a little bit to set us up for the discussion that we're starting today. If I were to come up with like 2 key words or themes for how our discussion went, I would say that a lot of it seemed to be focused on 2 related contexts with like within social media. So like one sort of key word would be attention, and one would be authenticity. And, you know, if we're thinking about privacy, a lot of it has to do with what we choose to share and why. So there's this really interesting question when we're thinking about like social media. It's kind of like, well, when we choose to share things, what are our goals? Like, what are we trying to do with this post? And in another sense, like, who is our imagined audience, right? Because if my imagined audience is like my best friend, my social media posts are going to be a lot more intimate than others, right? So there's this kind of sense that like you kind of have to conceptualize what it is that you're doing and who you're talking to when you post on social media. And for a lot of us, we have a lot of anxiety about this because we don't have a very clear sense of who that is. So I thought it was really interesting that like Kylie had this point about, well, yeah, but like I'll edit my posts for a long time and then be like, you know what? This just isn't gonna work. And I think one of the things that she's pointing to is the sense that like there is no like discrete single audience, but rather you're talking to a lot of different people. So what you're going to do is like, you know, try to, you know, like you want to be able to like, talk to a lot of different kinds of people at the same time. And you're not necessarily going to be able to just put it all out there, because you're going to have to do different things for different people. And sometimes we just give it up as a bad job. Like, this isn't going to work. This is kind of what Harrison was pointing out too when he said that like one of the things that social media does is like collapse context, right? We're no longer able to necessarily kind of tailor our like what we say to people or what we share with people as much as we can. And it's true, a lot of social media these days allows for different kinds of group postings, but it's kind of rough, you know? And so it's not as neat as it might be in the sense that like if you're in a room with people, you can literally look at all of the individuals in the room and decide what you want to say on the basis of who's there. So there's a little bit of like a context collapse, and something that sort of happens when you have a lot of people here. I also think it's really important to point out that, and I think this is going to be something that's like important going forward, that a lot of social media platforms, in part because there's so much happening, kind of encourage this kind of spectacle. So this was sort of related to, so like Hannah and Daniel had these points where they were a little bit concerned that in some sense, like maybe we live in public, it's not really so much about privacy, but about like people just like creating a spectacle of themselves, and like they're drinking too much and they're doing drugs and they're making bad choices. One of the things that I think, though, people have noticed about social media is that it's sometimes this sort of like attention seeking thing encourages and can sometimes exacerbate people's sense that, like, in order to get attention or in order to like have views, you kind of have to be really out there. And this is something that we're going to be talking about this week when we think about like Justine Sacco and the tweet that she made were about her AIDS joke right before she got on a plane. And so I think that's something that's like kind of important to be keeping in mind, right? So there is this sense, though, that it's not just about the individual choices that people are making, but it's about sort of systems of like what gets likes and like what people get sort of attention for, and whether that benefits them or harms them, sort of all things considered. And then, you know, like just kind of thinking about the broader context here. So one of the things that I'm thinking about in relation to this point is that very recently there was there's a guy and he has a prank site on YouTube. It's this really popular vlog. They do really funny jokes on people. I mean, sometimes some people think they're funny, some people think that they aren't. But there's a sense that like they're really like that's what he does for a living. He's like creating content via social media. And they were shooting something and they discovered a dead body in the woods and they filmed it and they posted it to social media. And there was a huge amount of backlash about just like, really? You're gonna like post an image of like you like found a dead body in the woods and like the first thing that you do is like make a video about it and post it online? Like, what are you doing, right? And there's a sense, though, when like that like something is happening here in like sort of how you're thinking about gaining attention, right? That like you've stopped thinking about something in one way and started thinking about it in another. And that is, and I think, something that we wonder whether social media encourages us to be focused on one kind of feedback rather than others. So I think that's going to be, and that's something that's going to come up again when we're talking about privacy and free speech, that like people should be able to say what they have, like whatever they want, but of course this infringes on the privacy of others. And that is absolutely something that's happening in the case of like if you find a dead body in the woods and like you post it to social media, like you're really, I mean, you're infringing on the privacy of the person who died. You're, you know, like think about their family who like might have had a missing person and that's how this breaks. Like this is, you know, it's a really upsetting thing to have happen. And so it seems like there's a lot of questionable judgment that's going on. But the question is this really about the choices that an individual, or only about the choices that an individual or a group of individuals are making? Or is this also about some sort of broader system of media, which is really encouraging us to try to get that attention, right? To try to create the spectacle. And so I think that's something that's being really touched on with this point about from We Live in Public. And Pam had this great point about vague booking, where you can just post to Facebook like, oh no, and like you don't really know what it is, right? So like people will follow up. And so that's a sense where like what's happening here is this kind of continuing, you know, like you're sort of seeking attention with different kinds of social media posts. But it's also interesting to know that this is something that I think is really common in media generally today, right? Like you think about clickbait and we think about sort of more professional media norms. There is certainly the sense that like we are creating a spectacle and we are trying to get people to click on things. So I think there are just these really interesting things at play that we're going to continue to be talking about as we move forward.